The moment the sheriff's cruiser rolled up our gravel driveway with its lights spinning red and blue, I knew the HOA had finally lost their minds. But what I didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives, because they weren't coming after me this time. They were coming after my wife, and that was something I could never forgive nor forget. Especially since she wasn't just any wife, but a federal agent who carried a badge that could freeze the blood of even the cockiest cop or power-hungry HOA president. Yet the story of how we got to that moment started weeks earlier when we first returned to our mountain cabin. A property I had inherited from my late grandfather, a place thick with cedar trees, wide porches, and the smell of pine needles baking in the afternoon sun. A retreat we both loved for its solitude, but apparently that same solitude had attracted the attention of a newly formed HOA that had expanded its reach like a creeping vine, swallowing cabins and properties that had stood outside their control for decades. And their president, a woman named Karen Whitmore, had made it her personal mission to rope us into her little suburban fiefdom, despite the fact that my grandfather's land deed, dated back to 1954, made it abundantly clear that no association, committee, or neighborhood covenant had any jurisdiction over it. Still, they came at us with threats, letters, fines, and constant harassment, demanding dues and compliance, claiming our security camera was a violation, that our firewood stack was improperly aligned, that our cabin door lock was unapproved. Hardware. Which sounded ridiculous until one Saturday afternoon when my wife decided to change the old brass lock on the front door to a sturdier deadbolt, an act of ordinary maintenance in any sane world, but in HOA land, it was apparently the equivalent of declaring war, because within 24 hours a citation was taped to our door claiming alteration without approval and demanding a reversal or fine of $2,500, something that made both of us laugh at first until the situation escalated in ways neither of us expected. For while I was used to HOA antics, having grown up in a neighborhood strangled by them, my wife had a level of discipline and authority that didn't bend easily. She was an agent for Homeland Security, trained to handle smugglers, traffickers, and men with more power than any HOA board could ever dream of. So when she read that letter, her lips tightened into a thin smile, the kind she wore when someone had stepped far out of line and was about to learn the consequences. And I swear the temperature in the cabin dropped 10 degrees, though the fire was blazing. Still, we ignored it, thinking the absurdity would collapse on its own weight. But that was the mistake. Because Karen and her board weren't content with intimidation, they wanted control. And when they realized we weren't going to bow, they started a campaign of harassment, driving slowly past our property at night, shining flashlights through the trees, even leaving anonymous notes in our mailbox saying, "Comply or lose the cabin," which turned my stomach with both fury and dread. But my wife collected each note carefully, placing them in a folder marked evidence, and told me in a calm, almost icy tone, "They don't know who they're playing with." Still, I underestimated the lengths Karen would go, until the morning we woke to find one of our security cameras ripped down and smashed on the porch, its wires dangling like veins. A message scrawled on the back of the HOA notice, "Last warning." And that was the moment I knew it was no longer petty harassment, but criminal intimidation. Something that would ignite my wife's full force, yet before she could even decide the next step, the phone rang with a number we didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was a man who identified himself as HOA compliance officer, which made my wife roll her eyes because no such official title existed. He threatened that unless we removed the new deadbolt and restored the old brass knob, they would escalate the matter to law enforcement. A statement so absurd I nearly laughed, but my wife took the phone, her voice firm, measured, and razor-sharp as she told him, "You're welcome to try," then hung up, her badge glinting slightly as she placed it on the counter beside the phone, almost as if reminding herself that the line between harassment and felony was thinner than most imagined. And sure enough, the very next afternoon, as clouds gathered, Low over the mountains and thunder rolled like distant cannons. We heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive and saw two sheriff's cruisers pulling up, followed by a black SUV that I recognized instantly as belonging to Karen, who stepped out in her tailored blazer and oversized sunglasses like she was about to host a press conference. Her lips curved into that self-satisfied smile of someone who thought she had finally cornered us. And the deputies, young men who looked barely out of the academy, approached with hesitant steps, telling us they'd received a report of suspicious activity, that a possible unlawful entry had taken place, and I nearly barked out a laugh because the unlawful entry was my wife replacing a lock on her own damn door. But Karen, standing smugly behind them, said, "See? They've tampered with the property. Our community has rules, Sheriff, and they refuse to comply." And the deputies, not fully understanding property law, looked unsure, until one asked if we had proof of ownership, to which my wife, cool as stone, stepped forward, her hand brushing open her jacket just enough to reveal the badge clipped to her belt, the silver and blue emblem shining under the gray afternoon light. And she said with absolute calm, "I'm Special Agent Ramirez, Homeland Security Investigations, and this is my property, which I can prove with federal documentation if you'd like, but unless you have a warrant or probable cause, you're trespassing on private land at the request of an individual who has no jurisdiction here." And I will never forget the look on the deputies' faces as the words sank in, the nervous flicker in their eyes, the subtle shift of their posture, as they realized they had been played by a meddling HOA president who had dragged them into a civil dispute that was outside their authority. Still, Karen sputtered, her face blotchy red, pointing a manicured finger and shouting that my wife was lying, that badges can be faked, that this whole property technically falls under the HOA's governance. Words so delusional I half expected lightning to strike her down where she stood, but my wife, unflinching, slowly produced her credentials, flipping them open with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had done it 1,000 times in interrogation rooms and border checkpoints, and the deputies froze, truly froze, as they read the seal and the lettering, realizing they were not dealing with some random homeowner but with a federal agent who outranked them by miles, and the silence that followed was so thick you could hear the cicadas in the trees until one deputy cleared his throat and muttered, "Ma'am, we didn't realize." But Karen, still refusing to surrender, hissed, "Don't let her intimidate you. She's bluffing!" and tried to push past them toward the porch, at which point my wife's voice turned to steel as she commanded, "Step back now, Ms. Whitmore, or I will consider this attempted unlawful entry and interference with a federal officer." A statement that made even the deputies stiffen, and finally, for the first time since this whole circus began, Karen faltered, her bravado cracking as she realized she had cornered herself. But this was only the beginning because my wife wasn't about to let it drop there. No, she had already decided the HOA's harassment had crossed the threshold into criminal conspiracy, and she was going to dismantle their little empire piece by piece, using tools they couldn't even begin to comprehend. And as I watched the deputies retreat to their cruisers, whispering into radios with uneasy glances at my wife, I knew the war with the HOA had just escalated into a battle they could never win. Because they had provoked the wrong woman, one who carried both the law and the fire of justice in her hands, and though the storm clouds above finally split into a downpour, drenching the scene in rain, it felt less like chaos and more like cleansing, the first crack of thunder announcing not the end, but the beginning of a reckoning that would shake the entire mountain community to its core. The rain had hardly stopped dripping from the eaves of our cabin before the true weight of what had just happened began to sink in, because while Karen had left that day humiliated and rattled by the flash of my wife's badge, the HOA was not, about to accept defeat quietly, and deep down both of us knew that a narcissist like Karen, Fueled by petty control and emboldened by the little army of board members she manipulated like chess pieces, would regroup and come back even harder, and sure enough, the very next morning, as the fog still clung to the mountainside like a veil, we found a new letter shoved under our door, not taped this time, but slid quietly in during the night, the paper damp with moisture, its message typed in bold black letters. Federal badge or not, this community has rules. You will comply, or you will be removed. That word, removed, sent a chill through me, not because I feared them, but because it showed how far their arrogance had carried them, how disconnected from law and reality they had become. And when my wife read it, she didn't flinch. She simply placed it in her evidence folder beside the other notes. But I could see in her eyes that this wasn't going to be ignored. This was ammunition. And she was already planning to fire back. Yet she didn't reveal her full hand to me. Not then. Not yet. Instead, she made a few phone calls. Quiet, coded conversations with colleagues I'd only ever heard about in vague fragments. People who worked in various agencies. And by the end of the day, she had a list of names. Board members of the HOA, financial officers, and contractors tied to their projects that she pinned on our cabin's corkboard like a crime investigation map, red strings connecting addresses, LLCs, and shell accounts. Because my wife had seen this pattern before, she explained HOAs weren't just busybodies with clipboards. They were often vehicles for money laundering, embezzlement, or petty corruption. And if Karen was this desperate to dominate one cabin, chances were she was hiding something much bigger, something worth exposing. So while the HOA doubled down on their campaign of harassment, sending out glossy newsletters accusing us of endangering community safety by modifying our entryway hardware, my wife was digging deep, pulling property records from the county, analyzing the HOA's tax filings, even visiting neighbors under the pretext of casual chats to gauge their opinions. And what we discovered shocked us. Far from being a united community, the majority of homeowners despised Karen and her board. They whispered about mysterious assessments, thousands of dollars in emergency dues that had been levied for projects that never materialized, landscaping that was never done, a new security gate that was never installed, money that simply vanished while Karen flaunted new jewelry, vacations, and her gleaming black SUV. But no one dared to confront her because she ruled with fear, threatening liens, foreclosure, and fines, using the sheriff's office like her personal hammer, a pattern that now made perfect sense to me, because the deputies who had shown up at our door weren't acting independently. They'd been manipulated by Karen's carefully crafted complaints, her way of painting herself as a protector of order while she siphoned funds in the background, and my wife, armed with both her badge and her relentless tenacity, saw the cracks immediately. She told me one night as we sat by the fire, the storm, outside echoing the turmoil brewing in the valley below. They think they're untouchable because no one has ever pushed back, but they picked the wrong cabin and the wrong family. Her words steady, her eyes gleaming with the kind of determination that made me both proud and uneasy, because I knew she wasn't going to stop until she tore down every lie they'd built, and as if sensing her resolve, the HOA escalated their tactics, this time moving from letters and citations to direct intimidation. Cars idling on the road. At midnight, drones buzzing over our roof. A neighbor who confided that board members had been asking intrusive questions about my wife's work schedule, trying to find weak spots. And the breaking point came when we returned one evening to find our shed door pried open, our tools scattered across the mud, and a single message spray-painted on the wall inside. "Get out!" All caps, dripping. Black paint that hadn't even dried yet, and that was the moment my wife decided to go fully on offense. She contacted a federal task force colleague under the guise of consultation. But I could tell this wasn't just a chat. She was putting pieces into motion. And within 48 hours, she had access to banking records that painted a damning picture. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned from HOA dues into shell companies registered to Karen's cousin, bogus maintenance invoices that led back to a non-existent landscaping firm, even suspicious overseas transfers that hinted at something beyond simple embezzlement. And when she laid it out for me across our dining table, the papers lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, I felt my stomach knot. This wasn't just neighborhood politics. This was organized fraud, maybe even racketeering. And Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was potentially a criminal mastermind, hiding behind the thin veneer of suburban order. Yet instead of rushing to expose her immediately, my wife played it with the patience of a hunter, letting Karen tighten the noose around her own neck, continuing to attend board meetings quietly, where Karen would sneer at her, dismiss her questions, and bark at other homeowners to stay in line. All the while, my wife recorded every word, building a file thicker than the HOA bylaws themselves, and sure enough, Karen grew bolder, filing an official complaint to the county claiming we were harboring illegal tenants at our cabin, a blatant fabrication meant to trigger inspections and fines. But when an inspector came, my wife greeted him at the door with her badge visible, and the poor man practically tripped over his clipboard as he apologized and left within minutes, clearly realizing he had been duped. But Karen's fury only escalated, and the night after that failed inspection, we heard footsteps on the porch, a shadow lingering by the window, and when I yanked open the door with a shotgun in hand, I caught sight of a figure sprinting into the trees, dropping a phone in the mud that my wife later examined, discovering it was a prepaid burner filled with text messages coordinating harassment, messages signed off with initials that matched 2 HOA board members, proof that Karen had turned her board into a stalking squad. And that was the final straw, because my wife contacted her federal office officially this time, not just back channel, and initiated what she called a preliminary field review, which was basically the first domino in a line that could lead to a full-blown federal investigation. But she warned me, once this starts, they'll know something's coming and they'll panic, and panicked people are dangerous. And she was right, because the very next day we woke to find not 1 but 3 patrol cars parked outside, deputies again summoned by Karen, this time with accusations that we had brandished firearms at community members. A bald-faced lie based on the shadow I had confronted, and when the deputies demanded to search the cabin, my wife stood firm, her badge gleaming as she reminded them they had no warrant, and when they pressed, she simply began reading the text messages aloud, pointing out the burner phone evidence, and asked them calmly if they wanted to be complicit in obstructing a federal investigation, at which point their entire demeanor shifted from aggressive to sheepish, and though they left without incident, the message was clear. Karen was throwing everything she had at us, legal, illegal, and psychological, trying to break us before we broke her. And in the midst of it all, neighbors began approaching quietly, slipping us envelopes of old HOA statements, whispered stories of threats, even one elderly man who confessed that Karen had forced him to sign over a strip of land under threat of foreclosure, and all of it added to the growing mountain of evidence. But the real turning point came when my wife uncovered a connection between Karen's HOA and a regional developer notorious for shady deals, a company that had been circling the mountain properties for years, eager to build luxury resorts, and suddenly the picture snapped into focus. Karen wasn't just pocketing money, she was clearing the board for a bigger play, driving out holdouts like us to make way for a buyout deal that would enrich her beyond imagination. And that was when my wife leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers, and said in that icy, calm voice that carried more weight than shouting ever could, "She's trying to clear the land. That's why she wants us gone. But she's sloppy, and we're going to bring her down." And I knew from the fire in her eyes that Section 1 of this war had ended with a badge. But Section 2 was about to end with handcuffs, and not ours. The quiet after the deputies pulled away that last time was more suffocating than the storm itself. A silence filled not with peace but with the coiled tension of an enemy regrouping, and my wife knew it too, because instead of relaxing, she doubled down, spending nights hunched over our table with files spread in a war map of bank statements, corporate registrations, and HOA minutes, the lamplight casting shadows across her focused face, her pen circling names and dates, her phone buzzing, with coded check-ins from colleagues who were feeding her leads. And though part of me wanted to believe we could wrap this up quickly, deep down, I realized Karen wasn't the kind of opponent who surrendered. She was the kind who clung harder the more cornered she became, like a drowning woman dragging others under with her. And sure enough, her desperation began to leak out across the community as rumors spread that federal agents were spying on the HOA, whispers that caused board members to bicker, neighbors to question dues, and one late night, I overheard two of Karen's allies arguing outside her SUV, one insisting they should step away, the other demanding loyalty, until Karen herself stormed out and hissed, "You're in this with me whether you like it or not." Her voice trembling not with authority, but with fear, because by then she knew my wife had collected too much, the kind of evidence that could burn not only her, but the developer she was funneling money toward. Yet instead of retreating, she turned vindictive, calling emergency board meetings where she railed against traitors, printing new fines for homeowners, escalating from $100 to thousands overnight, and then staging a spectacle where she hired private security, two bulky men in black uniforms with no real credentials, to patrol the neighborhood, a move that only made her look more like a dictator than a president. And when one of those hired thugs parked his truck halfway across our driveway, my wife walked right up to him, badge on her hip, and asked calmly, "Are you licensed to operate in this county?" The man stammered, muttered something about working for the HOA, and when pressed for identification, he fled down the road, leaving Karen fuming but humiliated again, her mask of control cracking in front of everyone who watched from behind. Curtains, yet that humiliation only made her lash out harder, this time by weaponizing the county zoning board, filing a complaint that our cabin was structurally unsafe and not up to code. And within days, an inspector was dispatched. But unlike before, this one lingered, taking photographs, jotting notes, clearly under pressure to find something wrong, until my wife pulled out not just her deed and federal ID, but a copy of correspondence she'd dug up showing that Karen had already approached the developer about parcel acquisition, referencing our lot number specifically, and when she slid that paper across the inspector's clipboard, his eyes widened, and though he tried to mask it, I knew he realized he was being used as a pawn in a land grab, because he left quickly and never returned, leaving Karen fuming in her SUV outside our gate, her hands clenching the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, and from that day forward, everything about her demeanor shifted. Her pristine hair began to fray, her tailored clothes looked less polished, and her eyes darted around like a trapped animal, because neighbors had begun whispering openly, emboldened by my wife's defiance, and several approached us with stories of coercion. A retired couple, whose monthly dues had mysteriously doubled, a single mother fined for painting her shutters the wrong shade of beige, a veteran threatened with foreclosure because of a flagpole in his yard, all of which my wife documented meticulously, adding to her growing federal report, which by then was a dossier thicker than any HOA handbook, and though Karen still strutted around like she was queen of the valley, her power was slipping. Cracks forming as board members started skipping meetings, one even showing up at our door trembling, asking if my wife could protect him if he came forward, because he had bank records proving Karen had funneled money into her personal account. And my wife, calm as always, assured him that cooperation was the best shield, but warned that timing was everything, because she wanted Karen desperate enough to make a final mistake, one that would justify the full weight of federal charges, and sure enough, that mistake came not long after, on a night heavy with the smell of rain when we heard a thud against the cabin wall and found a brick lying in the mud, wrapped in a note scrawled with the words, "This ends now." And while I was ready to storm into Karen's house myself, my wife stopped me, her hand firm on my shoulder, and said, "No, we let her end it on record." and installed 2 hidden trail cameras around the cabin, capturing not just wildlife but the shadows of men creeping across our land at night. Men we later matched to Karen's so-called private security, clear proof of stalking and intimidation. And with every new piece of evidence, my wife's dossier grew heavier, until even I, flipping through it one night, felt a kind of awe at the sheer scale of what Karen had done. Not just harassment, but fraud, extortion, criminal conspiracy, and yet Karen still didn't know how badly she was cornered, because in her paranoia she doubled down yet again, storming into a community meeting and screaming that my wife was a fraud, that her badge was fake, and that she had connections at the state level who would deal with her, words so wild that even her loyalists shifted uneasily, and when my wife stood up calmly, holding out her badge for anyone to inspect, silence filled the room. Neighbors leaning forward, eyes widening as they realized Karen's entire narrative was collapsing. And though Karen tried to pivot, claiming she was protecting property values, it was too late. The tide had turned. Homeowners began murmuring, some even clapping as my wife outlined in measured words that she was not only a property owner, but a federal investigator, and that anyone who had been extorted by the HOA should come forward now, because the window for leniency would soon close. And I will never forget the look on Karen's face then, a mix of rage and fear, her lips trembling as she realized she was losing control, not just of the board, but of the narrative she'd built. And that night, as we walked back under the dim streetlights, my wife leaned in and whispered, "She'll try something reckless now. Watch her closely." And she was right, because the very next evening, Karen's SUV was back outside our gate, idling for nearly an hour before tearing off into the night. And later we learned she had driven straight to the developer's regional office, where she demanded an urgent meeting, a meeting my wife's contacts managed to record, in which Karen practically confessed to everything, promising parcels, admitting to financial adjustments, and even acknowledging that one stubborn family was holding everything up, words that were now preserved as audio evidence. And when my wife played the recording on her laptop, the sound of Karen's frantic voice filling our cabin, I knew the endgame had arrived, but my wife wasn't ready to strike yet. She wanted Karen to twist a little longer, to reveal just how deep the rot went. And so she waited. And in that waiting period, Karen truly unraveled, her once loyal board splintering, her neighbors avoiding her, her SUV vandalized one night with the words thief spray-painted across the side, and the next time I saw her in the grocery store, her eyes were wild, her hair unkempt, her cart half empty as she muttered to herself. And it struck me then that this woman, who had wielded fear like a weapon, was now drowning in it herself. But sympathy was impossible after everything she'd done, and when she finally made her last desperate move, filing a false police report claiming my wife had assaulted her at a meeting, she signed her own downfall, because when officers arrived to question us, my wife handed them not only a time-stamped video, proving she had never left the cabin that evening, but the full dossier, neatly organized, with every receipt, photo, audio clip, and sworn statement, and the officers, realizing they were sitting on a bombshell, left in silence, their faces pale, their hands gripping the file as though it might burn them. And that was the moment I knew Section 3 of this war was over, because Karen hadn't just lost control, she had triggered the federal hammer my wife had been holding back, and now nothing could stop it from falling. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, with a pale orange glow streaking the misty horizon, it wasn't just another morning in the cabin. It was the day the war shifted from a shadow fight in the woods and meeting rooms to the unmistakable sound of boots on gravel, radios crackling, and the official seal of the United States printed boldly on warrant envelopes, because my wife had spent the past week preparing every piece of evidence with the meticulousness of a surgeon, her dossier now so thick it could have anchored a shelf. And when she made the final call to her federal office 3 nights earlier, She had spoken in that calm, deliberate voice that signaled the point of no return. "Activate it, we're ready." And I remember the way my chest tightened at those words, because it meant the storm we had endured was finally about to break outward, unleashing its force on Karen and her board. And sure enough, at precisely 6 a.m., the mountain air was shattered by the arrival of 3 black SUVs and 2 unmarked sedans, followed closely by sheriff's cruisers whose deputies now carried a different posture. Not the hesitant pawns of Karen's manipulation, but allies briefed and sober, aware that they had been misled and determined to correct course. And from our porch we watched as agents in dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering fanned out with precision. Some heading for the HOA office, others approaching Karen's property, their movements smooth, efficient, and undeniable. And for a moment I almost pitied her. Almost, because through the half-open blinds across the street I saw her silhouette. Freeze! Her hands pressed against the glass as the convoy pulled up, and then the flurry of motion as she scrambled inside. Too late, because the knock on her door wasn't a polite neighborly tap, but the thunderous pounding of federal authority. And when she tried not to answer, a command boomed out, "Federal agents! Open the door!" And even from our porch I could hear the quiver of panic in her shouted reply, "You have no right! This is private property!" Words that might have cowed neighbors but fell flat against the weight of a signed warrant. And when the door opened, whether by her hand or their shoulder, the sight was unforgettable. Karen standing in her once immaculate foyer, robe clutched at her chest, hair disheveled, eyes wild, screaming about conspiracies, waving stacks of papers that were nothing, more than HOA minutes as though they were shields, while agents calmly pushed past her, cataloging files, seizing computers, and placing evidence markers on documents. And it was in that surreal moment that years of her tyranny seemed to collapse like a rotten beam. Neighbors emerging from their porches to watch, murmurs rippling through the community as the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was reduced to a frantic woman cornered by her own arrogance. But it didn't stop there, because while Karen wailed and cursed, her board members were being served simultaneously. One dragged half asleep from his deck in pajamas, another found trying to shred files in his garage, only to be stopped by a sharp, "Step away now," from an agent. And by mid-morning the community that had once lived under Karen's shadow now buzzed with the undeniable realization that the empire was gone. The HOA offices stripped bare, boxes of fraudulent records carried out, hard drives bagged, and Karen herself finally handcuffed on her own front steps, her face twisted with disbelief as if she couldn't comprehend that her rules, her fines, her threats meant nothing against actual law, and while she shrieked at the agents about property values and community standards, my wife stood calmly by, badge on display, the very image of justice embodied, and though Karen tried, one last desperate ploy, turning to the deputies she had once commanded and screaming, "Arrest her! She's the one breaking laws!" The deputies did not move, their eyes downcast, ashamed but resolute, because they knew the truth now, and when Karen realized no one was coming to her rescue, her voice cracked into sobs, but the cuffs stayed on, and the sight of her being guided into the back of a black SUV was the clearest signal yet that the nightmare she had created was finally ending. Still, the aftermath was far from quiet, because the raid sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had once been silent now knocking on our door with trembling hands, offering statements, signed affidavits, bank slips, photos of harassment, all eager to unburden themselves of the years of intimidation they had endured. And my wife accepted each one with professional composure, cataloging, scanning, and forwarding, until the case had grown from a local skirmish into a federal storm, one that now drew the attention of prosecutors who saw in it not just petty fraud, but organized exploitation of an entire neighborhood, and within days, indictments followed, not only against Karen, but against her cousin, the so-called contractor, and even a regional manager of the developer who had orchestrated the land grab scheme, their names printed in black and white in the county paper, shocking those who had once dismissed it all as HOA drama. And in that surreal week, our cabin, once a target, became the unofficial command post. Agents dropping by for updates, neighbors bringing food and coffee as though repaying a silent debt, and through it all my wife remained steady, her expression never gloating, only determined. Because for her this wasn't about revenge, it was about principle, about making sure no one else would endure what we had. And the final act of Section 4 came one late afternoon when the first court hearing was held. The packed courtroom buzzing with reporters, neighbors filling every bench, the air thick with anticipation, and Karen, in an ill-fitting suit, wrists, free but dignity gone, was marched in by marshals. Her face pale, her eyes darting nervously, and when the charges were read, wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, harassment, the weight of them silenced even her. No outbursts this time, just a hollow stare as her own lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, and though she tried to catch my wife's gaze across the room, hoping perhaps for some acknowledgement, she got nothing but a calm, unwavering stare. Because in that moment, it wasn't neighbor versus neighbor. It was law versus corruption, and the law had finally caught up. And as the judge set bail astronomically high, murmurs rippled through the gallery, and I realized with a strange clarity that this was no longer our private battle. It was history for the valley, a warning written in court transcripts and headlines, that no HOA, no self-proclaimed ruler, was above justice. And as we walked out of that courthouse into the fading sunlight, neighbors clapping us on the back, reporters shouting questions, and Karen's shrill protests fading behind us, I knew Section 4 of this saga had closed not with another confrontation on our porch, but with the iron weight of federal law slamming down, leaving only one section left, the reckoning that would decide whether Karen's fall would be her end or the beginning of something even darker. The gavel struck like a thunderclap inside the cavernous federal courtroom, echoing off the marble columns as though the very bones of justice were waking from a long sleep, and I remember gripping the edge of the bench as my wife sat straight-backed. Beside me, her expression a perfect mask of resolve, because this was the culmination of months of fear, confrontation, and relentless pursuit of truth. And across the room, at the defense table, sat Karen, the once untouchable queen of the HOA, now reduced to a hollow figure, her tailored suit hanging loosely, her hair stiff with too much spray, her hands twisting the edges of her notepad until the corners tore, yet her eyes still burned with that stubborn glint, a refusal to accept that her empire had crumbled. And as the prosecutor stood, his voice steady, he began to weave the damning story piece by piece, presenting every shred of evidence my wife had so painstakingly assembled. Falsified contracts, bank transfers siphoned from HOA dues into Karen's personal account, intimidation letters sent under the guise of community enforcement, testimony from neighbors who had been bullied into silence for years, even recordings my wife herself had captured of Karen's threats, and with each new exhibit entered, Karen's facade cracked further, her lawyer sweating, shuffling papers, objecting weakly only to be overruled by the judge. And while Karen tried at moments to flash her old bravado, whispering furiously into her attorney's ear or smirking when certain witnesses faltered, the truth was relentless, undeniable, and for once she was powerless against it. And when my wife took the stand, the courtroom fell into a hush so deep you could hear the shuffle of the stenographer's keys, because her testimony wasn't just a recitation of facts, it was a narrative, a story of neighbors living under siege, of power abused for profit, of laws twisted into weapons, and when she reached the part about the night Karen had called the cops on us simply for changing a cabin lock, then froze when the badge came out, the jurors leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously, and I could see in their faces that the picture was complete. Karen wasn't a misguided neighbor. She was a predator hiding behind bylaws, And when cross-examination came, Karen's attorney tried to rattle my wife, tried to paint her as vengeful, but my wife met every insinuation with calm, every loaded question with clarity, never raising. Her voice never flinching, and the longer it went on, the more desperate the defense looked until the judge finally snapped, "Move on, counselor." And I knew then the scales had tipped fully, and when closing arguments arrived, the prosecutor spoke not only of law, but of community, of the sacred trust that binds neighbors together, and how Karen had trampled that. Trust turned it into a personal empire, while the defense sputtered about misunderstandings and overzealous federal agents. But the words rang hollow in the vaulted room, and then the jury filed out, and the waiting began, every second stretching like hours, neighbors clustered in the gallery whispering prayers, reporters outside flashing their lights through the windows, and Karen sitting rigid, her lips moving as if reciting a mantra to herself, until at last the doors swung open, and the foreman, a middle-aged man with calloused hands, stood tall, the slip of paper trembling only slightly as he read the words that would etch themselves into memory forever. On all counts, we find the defendant guilty, and for a heartbeat the room was utterly silent before erupting into gasps, sobs, and muffled cheers. Neighbors clasping each other's hands, the prosecutor nodding solemnly. And Karen, oh Karen, she didn't collapse, didn't faint like in the movies. Instead, she shot to her feet, her face red, her voice shrieking accusations of corruption, betrayal, even pointing at my wife, screaming, "She planted it all! She's the real criminal." But her words dissolved into the clatter of marshals restraining her, the judge pounding his gavel so hard the bench rattled, and when order was restored, Karen slumped into her chair, eyes glazed, lips trembling. A queen dethroned in the most public way possible, and as sentencing day arrived weeks later, the courthouse was fuller than ever. The story having spread across state lines, journalists dubbing it the cabin case, law journals dissecting it as a precedent for HOA abuse. And when the judge delivered the sentence, 20 years in federal prison, restitution of every stolen dollar, and a permanent ban from holding any position of fiduciary responsibility, there was no applause, no cheers, just a heavy collective exhale, the sound of an entire community finally released from bondage. And as Karen was led away in chains, she turned one last time, her eyes locking with mine, and there was no hatred there, only something colder, a promise, perhaps that this wasn't over, but even that couldn't shake me, because outside those walls, life had already begun to bloom again. Neighbors rebuilding, painting fences, hosting barbecues free from fear, and our cabin, once a battleground, had become a symbol, visitors stopping by to thank us, to thank my wife for her courage, some even pressing letters into her hands asking for help in their own communities. And while she smiled politely, I could see the weight in her eyes, the knowledge that the fight against corruption is never truly over, that Karen was only one face of a larger beast. But for now, in that summer light, with the mountains standing eternal behind us and laughter drifting on the breeze, there was peace, fragile but real. And as we sat on our porch that evening, the same porch where it all began, my wife's hand in mine, I realized that though Karen had tried to break us, she had instead forged us into something stronger, unshakable. And whatever came next, we were ready, because we had faced the storm and won. And the echoes of her downfall would serve as a warning to every HOA tyrant across the country. Power built on fear will always crumble when truth stands firm. And with that, our chapter closed, not with the creak of a cabin door in the night, but with the steady heartbeat of a community finally free.